Well, a lot of people know who Harriet Tubman is, right? She was the person who helped free slaves. She freed herself, and she would go on this thing called the Underground Railroad. But instead of talking about Harriet Tubman and what she did to free the slaves, I think we should talk about the situation as a whole involving the Underground Railroad and its origin. So that's what we're going to talk about for the final day of Black History Month. So let's talk a little bit about Harriet for a second. So Harriet Tubman was born March 1822, and because she was a slave, she doesn't have an exact birthday because that was not documented. Eventually, Harriet decided to make her escape. Her and her brothers, she was around 25 years old, between those ages, and they made the escape September 17th, 1949. And they traveled all the way from Delaware to Pennsylvania, which was a total of 90 miles, which takes about 3 weeks on foot. I mean, they didn't have any other type of transportation, so they had to walk it. When they made it, Harriet met with some other people and they helped her go back to Delaware to rescue more slaves, and they would go back and forth, and this is what created the Underground Railroad. So the Underground Railroad was made up of, freed slaves helping, obviously, and also like Black people who were still enslaved, and also like white abolitionists. They all teamed up to help bring people from the South to the North. So obviously it wasn't an actual Underground Railroad. Everything happened above ground. But the name Underground Railroad came from a writer who wrote the phrase in a Washington newspaper that said, "A young slave hoping to be freed hops on the Underground Railroad all the way down to Boston." So that's originally where the term comes from, and that just kind of stuck. They would also use terms such as like conductors, which is the people who would help them go back and forth. And they would also use the term like stations, which was like the hiding places that the slaves would be in. But it was just like a bunch of routes that people would take back and forth. And because so many people that Harriet worked with went missing, and so many slaves in general started going missing, the slave owners would put out posters saying that they would give out rewards to anyone who could help catch these slaves, right? And so this is what created slave catchers. And these slave catchers, they wanted that money. So they would capture just like any Black person that would come in their way, freed or not. And this is what led to movies like 12 Years a Slave, where you have a freed person, a person who was always free, never was a slave, get captured and then become a slave because of these slave catchers. And the original plan for these slaves who would escape from the South and go to the North, their original plan was to go all the way to Canada, because slavery was still legal in certain states of the US. So they were like, oh, if we could still get captured and stuff, and there's a possibility of us becoming